invited to fill out a 3x5 card, and if you wanted to have a question presented to Fahim, and then we're going to be collecting those questions. So Fahim, if you want to sit down,
all right.
We're going to get started here. Before we do, though, I want to just take a minute to, first of all, say thank you to Lutheran Church Charities. Lutheran Church Charities is represented tonight by Jim Morrison, and it's great to have you here. Thank you so much. Can we give God a praise clap for Jim and for Lutheran Church Charities? And Tim Hessner was hoping to be here. He sent me an email, and he's coming off of that flu, but Jim, it's great to have you. And this is your film crew here. This is Lutheran Church Charities film crew here, and I believe it's Sean. Yep, and thank you for being here. And so this is being recorded, and also we are live streaming. So I want to welcome everybody who's joining us via social media. It's great to have you as well. And I know people like my mom and dad who volunteer with immigrants in the St. Louis area. They have shared the live stream feed for tonight, and so they're going to be sharing that with many people in the St. Louis area. And it's interesting, I was talking with my dad this afternoon after I woke up from my Sunday siesta, and my dad shared something interesting with me. The Lutheran Foundation of St. Louis put a challenge grant in front of Christian Friends of New Americans. My parents volunteer for Christian Friends of New Americans. They help resettle immigrants, refugees into the St. Louis area. And the challenge grant was whatever the local churches will raise, we'll double it. And so there are 80,000 Lutherans in the St. Louis area. And my dad's rather an industrious person, and so they sent out letters to all the churches. Do you have any idea how much money they have raised? They are still counting. It just started. They have raised over $600,000. Yes, and they're still going. And so there's a huge amount of interest in this and in helping our immigrants and our refugees. And so we are so blessed to have Fahim here. And I'm going to share a little bit of his bio with you in just a little bit. I do want to say this, that he and I are going to be driving down to Springfield, Illinois tonight. Tomorrow morning, I am going to be presenting 35 cases of airmen who are requesting the religious exemption from the vaccination requirement. And I'll be presenting these cases to the wing commander, the doc, and the JAG. And so I would appreciate your prayers for my time tomorrow. And so we're going to head down, and Fahim has an appointment with the general down there, and so we're going to be busy tomorrow. So we want to get on the road by about 8:30 tonight, okay? And so we'll see how it goes. I want to recognize all of our veterans. If you are serving or you have served in the military, or if you have a loved one who's serving or has served in the military, could you raise your hands? Perry's like, come on, Mike. All right, that's awesome. Thank you for your service. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you. And we are getting the checks made up, and those will, Lutheran Church Charities was so kind as to put out a request to its supporters to help Fahim's family. And just like oftentimes happens, they actually collected a couple rounds of funds and sent those to the church, because they always do that through the local church. And the first check went to Fahim and his family. And then the second check is actually getting cut right now. And we had another church, St. John's in Marengo, Illinois. Caleb Schauer is the pastor there. Hello, Caleb. And his church took a door offering, and they raised $500 to support his family as well. So we want to recognize them also. So, with that being said, I want to start us with a word of prayer. And then my first question for you is going to come from my mom.
Okay.
My mom texted me just a little while ago. Yes, and so she says, well, I'll read the question to you here in just a minute.
All right.
Okay. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Lord be with you. Father, we just thank you for today. We thank you for all of your blessings upon our lives. We thank you, Father, for Fahim and for his faithful service to this country and his sacrificial love for his parents and his siblings. We pray, Father, for their integration here and for all of their needs to be met. We thank you, Father, that we get to have this time together. We pray that it will be an encouragement to Fahim. Bless him and bless his family in this country. Father, we pray these things in Jesus' name. And all of God's children, we all say, Amen. Amen. All right, so let me read Fahim's bio for you here to get started. Fahim Masoud, my friend, was born in Kabul, Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union was still in Afghanistan in 1988. I looked and I said, holy cow, he is a young guy. And handsome, too, right? Fast forward 18 years and 3 regime changes later, he had 3 options before him once he graduated from high school. Go to India on a scholarship, go to a local university in Afghanistan, or apply for the risky job of interpreter for the United States military. Masoud applied for a job as an interpreter with the United States Army. Now, you worked with the Army. Did you also work with the Marines?
Briefly, very briefly with...
That's enough, yeah. Little inter-service humor here, yeah. When I was wondering, did you ever work with Air Force people? No, never. Okay, yeah, that's a rare delight. For the next 18 months, he supported U.S. Army personnel throughout Afghanistan, regularly going on convoy, helping the U.S. military train Afghan security forces. Eventually, his immediate American mentor offered him a chance to come to the United States to pursue his education in the early days of the SIV, Special Immigrant Visa, which you may have heard about a lot in the news recently. And he soon ended up in St. Louis, great place, with $99 in his pocket. He began his studies. In August of 2017, having completed his education, married his wife, he decided, and the education continued after marriage.
Right.
Yes, that's right. He decided to join the Illinois Army National Guard as an intelligence officer. 4 years after joining the Army in August of 2021, Lieutenant Masoud was on a different mission to get the rest of his family out of Afghanistan and bring them safely to the U.S. In the coming weeks that ensued, he pursued this mission with every means possible, from finding safe houses for his family in Kabul, cold calling generals, working with the CIA team, and talking a driver through getting his family and other refugees to the airport in real time. So, we definitely want to hear about that. I think it would also be good for us to hear a little bit about Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
And then also, I think it'd be really helpful for us to learn from you how we as Christians, as a church, can best serve our new neighbors. I think that would be a tremendous blessing for us also. So, first question I'd like to ask you is if you could tell us about your parents and how they met.
All right, that is quite an interesting question, especially if you grew up in Afghanistan and you come from an Islamic country, and not any Islamic country, but quite a conservative Islamic country. First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I know the weather is quite, cold. I come from Northern Virginia, so it's a big difference for me. Thanks to Colonel Buckman, I have always I've always appreciated him. He was quite wonderful when I was on COVID orders from January of this year to August of this year. We had a lot of service members that were impacted by COVID, whose family members were impacted by COVID, and the colonel and chaplain, I should say, or the pastor, went above and beyond with the team that he was working with, actually, to help those service members. Thank you also to you for, again, showing up, but not only showing up, but for being willing to listen and for helping immigrants. The church, actually, churches across America have always been quite willing to and quite on the front lines, helping refugees dating back to the Vietnam War. And at that time, we didn't have all these resettlement agencies that we have in America, and a lot of them are receiving federal aid. So it was really the churches that the Vietnamese came to receive help. Some of them actually even slept at churches when they first showed up. So thank you. My parents, the way they met was very different than the way you and I met our wives. So I come from a pretty liberal family. I mean, I was born when the Soviets were still there. My father was a former Special Forces colonel in the old Afghan army that was trained by the Soviet Union. So he was in college, and he was going through this village, and my mother was, playing outside, and, he saw her, and, it was love at first sight, sent his parents to ask for her hand, and that's how they met and eventually married each other. So
That's wonderful.
yeah, so.
If you could, Fahim, could you briefly explain the ethnic language composition of Afghanistan?
Yes, so it is quite a complicated country to understand, and the reason is because it's so diverse. It's as diverse as the United States is, right? And the United States did not start out as a diverse country. Afghanistan, from a very long time ago, has been very, very diverse, very tribal. So you've got the Pashtuns, which is one of the largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and when we will talk about the Taliban, I call them the terrorist group. The United States government obviously has refused to call them as such, but they are really, in every way, a major terrorist group. So that's where most the Taliban members come from the Pashtun ethnic group. Then you've got the Tajiks, the second largest ethnic group. Then you've got other minority groups like the Hazaras, like the Baluchis, like the Uzbeks. And the reason Afghanistan turned out to be so diverse is because of the number of empires that have gone through the country historically. Like, we have the Hazaras. They're Afghan, but obviously they look like as if they're from China or Vietnam or any other Asian country. And the reason is because they're descendants of Genghis Khan when he showed up in Afghanistan in the 13th century, and then when his army disintegrated, guess what? These people stayed. And then you had, a number of other empires come through Afghanistan, the British, obviously the Soviet Union, and the Americans. And every time a huge empire went through Afghanistan or went to Afghanistan, not only did they change that country, but that country changed them in return. And even in the last 20 years, you had a lot of American soldiers that married Afghans, both men and women. And so it's quite interesting to see how the country's demographic continued to be shaped by these external forces.
Very interesting. What should Americans know about our new neighbors in order to be more helpful in welcoming them?
I think that the biggest, like I said, the biggest issue for a lot of these refugees, for a lot of these immigrants coming into the country, not everyone is going to show up and speak English and be educated, because if you look at the number of people who have come, a great number of them are going to be former interpreters that work for the U.S. government, for the U.S. military in Afghanistan. Then you have the non-governmental organization employees. Then you're going to have a lot of them are going to be Afghan what we call commandos or Afghan special forces that work directly with our special forces and with the CIA. And some of these people come from rural parts of Afghanistan. So if you're coming from the city, I always was in the city, grew up, was born in a large city, Kabul, and then grew up in Herat, Western Afghanistan, not too far from Iran. So if you are coming from an urban area of Afghanistan, you're going to be pretty educated. Chances are you're going to be, understanding the English language. But if you're coming from a rural area, you're going to be faced with a lot of challenges in the United States. You're not going to understand the culture very well. You're not going to speak the language very well. I think the biggest thing is really for people in America to understand where they come from and work with them and their children to make sure that they understand the value of education so that they grow up appreciating the United States and its values. Because the only way you can really get immersed in the American culture, right, is to understand, speak the language very well. I went through great lengths to learn the language the way I did. And I emphasize that. This is the most important thing you can do in the United States as a new refugee, as a new immigrant, and learn the English language, and then, adopt the United States values. I'm not going to get political, but don't come in and try to change something so that it benefits you. Come into the system and make sure that you value the cherished values of this country.
Okay, so this one actually is from my dad.
All right.
What has prompted you to come to Faith Lutheran Church and speak with us?
Your son. So Colonel Buckman and I met at Triton College. That was the first vaccination site I was running back in January of this year, and immediately we got both political and entered, religious discussions, political discussions. But because I would like to think we're gentlemen and could tolerate each other, right? We became really good friends. And then I actually came with my wife to this church on Easter. So, but yeah.
Dad, did you hear that? Okay. Okay. Have women in Afghanistan been treated better in previous generations?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one of the best things that came out of the American involvement in Afghanistan for the last 20 years was that it benefited in a huge way Afghan women. I mean, they got an education, and a lot of them luckily got to come to the United States and get an education and then stayed. That was, I would say, the most remarkable achievement of the United States in Afghanistan, empowering women in Afghanistan to get an education and become independent in every way. But unfortunately now, those women are at risk, and the ones that work, were activists or work for the U.S. government, their lives are at grave risk.
Fahim, what is the biggest challenge for your family now?
I think the biggest challenge, so I got my parents who are elderly, and then my 3 siblings out of Afghanistan. Like I said, I come from a pretty liberal background, a pretty well-educated family. For them, my parents did not want to leave, right? And understandably so. They had everything set up in Herat, Afghanistan. They wanted to live there. They had invested there in every way. They are from there. So for their life to get upended like this because of the takeover of the country by the Taliban, it was quite traumatic. 20 years of 20 years of essentially achievements, went up in smoke in a couple of weeks. For the younger siblings, again, I had a sibling that was in medical school. I had a sibling that is a trained lawyer, and then I had my youngest brother was in high school. So he was just getting ready to graduate high school when the Taliban took over the country. For me, the challenge is really to make sure that they are educated and they're gonna, learn the language and go on to prosper in this country.
What is your dream?
Oh, my dream. What's my dream? The dream is to continue to serve this country because I owe a lot of my success to this country. This is why I signed up, and wanted to serve in the military. So I'm going to continue to do what I love, which is essentially being in uniform.
What common points of discussion can a Christian have with a Muslim?
I think the way most Muslims are obviously brought up, especially Afghans, is that we share, one God. And I think this is the biggest misconception on the part of Christians, that maybe Muslims don't respect us, or because we don't share the Muslim faith, but we look at Jesus as our one of key prophets. And so there is already, more than enough common ground to initiate a conversation.
Yeah, I believe there are more references to Jesus
than Muhammad.
Yeah. That's right. So, what has impressed and also what has disappointed you regarding Christians in America?
I think, and this is what I'm going to say is universal. I think the hypocrisy of all of us, right? We all like to think that we are, Christians or whatever, and then don't live up to the ideals, to the values that we are espousing. So that's really the biggest, I would say. That I wouldn't call it a disappointment, but yeah, whatever you would call it.
Yep. I think that was from my dad also. What relationships with Christians have meant the most to you?
So again, I grew up in an extremely secular household. For me, the way we were brought up, it was never really a question of this person is different, this person is white, this person is, Christian or African American. So for me, because I look at people as humans first, so it's very easy for me to establish, contact and begin friendships, and I think that's evidenced by our relationship.
Absolutely. We're going to take a pause here for just a second. We have a presentation. Jim, would you like to come up? I'll be the bag man.
All right.
And
Well, Lutheran Church Charities was fortunate enough to have the Mission Quilters of St. John Lutheran Church in Lombard present us with 26 military-themed quilts that we could distribute to veterans and active duty men and women. So tonight I would like to present Lieutenant Masoud.
Oh, I
the United
appreciate
States
it.
Army quilt that was made by these ladies.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm honored. Thank you very much. Thank
There
you.
you are.
Thank
Now,
you.
now the weather's getting cold. And then
Thank you.
we also have a kind of a patriotic themed quilt that I want to present to the lieutenant that he can give to his family.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate
Yes.
you. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
That's Jesse's too. Thank you. Thank you.
Put this back in here.
Yep. And then Rick Bersano is making his way up. Do you need a minute, Rick, or you good? Okay. Sounds good. Okay.
I'm sure it's just a coincidence that there's two of you going in the car to Springfield tonight in the cold, and you have
Come on, Rick. Come on. Yeah, come up here. Come on. So, Fahim, this is Rick Bersano, and Rick is a man of many hats in our congregation. And Rick would like to present on behalf of Lutheran Church Charities and people who have also sent money, a check, a representative, a facsimile, I think is the correct term for it, of a check for.
This is what we've collected so far.
Okay, and you want to tell Fahim?
Oh,
So
thank you.
So far, which you've gotten some already, we've collected $5,726.
Thank you.
And there's more to come.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, very good. So we've got some questions up here. So the first question is, how do you feel about becoming a U.S. citizen?
When I first, obviously, I came to the United States. I was an interpreter in Afghanistan, and then I came to the United States on a student visa, and it was a very long, arduous process for me to become a U.S. citizen. But I mean, I was in line for it. I did everything I was supposed to in order to legally become what they call a permanent resident or green card holder, and then obviously a U.S. citizen. It meant the world to me. I think, especially coming obviously from Afghanistan. James Mathis, a lot of you guys probably know him, the Marine Corps, and I'm going to quote a Marine. He's a great man, a really wonderful guy, really smart guy, and he's saying when he goes around and gives these interviews, he says America is still defending. And that's really quite powerful because, to me, that means a lot because, you talk to some Americans and they're like, well, why didn't you want to stay back and fight the Taliban and make your country better? The way I look at it is your country has got to do for you in the beginning enough, like when you are born, you got to be able to drive on a paved street. You want to be able to call 911 anytime you want. So when you don't get services, any kind of services from a country, then you can't really, be expected to stay in a country like that and serve. Whereas in the United States, I mean, I showed up as an interpreter with $99 in my pocket, and I would say that I made it in many ways in America as a result of the kinds of practices that this country already has in place, the kind of essentially laws. Any country its survival is going to be dependent on the kinds of laws that it is espousing. And this country is beautiful in every way. I mean, the fact that I could have made it here, it just tells you so much about this country and how wonderful it is.
What helped you make the decision to partner with the U.S. to support the work in Afghanistan?
You know, when you're 18, I constantly say, I'm 33 years old now, and I constantly tell people that war is a young person's game. I don't want to say a young man's game, but it really is. And when you're 18, 19 years old, this is why, you know, you really should go infantry when you're so young. I just wanted to be in uniform. I wanted to be in a cool Humvee and essentially go blow things up. And that's what I wanted to do, and I got it. So that was really the motivation.
There you go. Yep. So the Middle East region has been known to be ruled by tribes for years. In your opinion, how do we bring peace to the Middle East region? In 100 words or less.
I would speak for Afghanistan. I think the withdrawal, everyone in this room agreed that at some point the United States had to get out of Afghanistan. But the way we got out of Afghanistan was quite dangerous, quite reckless, and it really left a lot of good people behind, and it essentially handed the country to the Taliban, and it didn't have to be done that way. Essentially, the political leadership in this country has a very short memory, and you know, we tend to always forget the lessons of history. But it took us a long time to rebuild Korea and make Korea democratic, make Taiwan democratic, make Japan in a lot of ways democratic. And I wish the United States continued its diplomatic relations with Afghanistan so that the country could have prospered. And of course, now that is not possible because it's run by a terrorist government. Just think about, you know, the United States being in Afghanistan for 20 years, having fought the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, removed them from power, only 20 years later to hand it back to them. It just is quite really, but yeah, quite hard to watch.
Maybe that's a good segue to, if you want to share about getting your family out.
Yes, so like I said, my family was so I have a brother who's in San Francisco. He was an engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I have a brother-in-law in New Mexico that worked for one of our intelligence agencies in southern Afghanistan. So my whole family has been working for the U.S. government in the last 20 years. So we were quite invested in essentially the cause that the United States was advocating for in Afghanistan, which was to turn it into a democratic society. And the most important thing for any society in the world is really tolerance, right? Like, I came to this country, did not know what to expect, and yet nobody stopped me at the grocery store and said, hey, you don't belong here. And so, and the tolerance that we have in this society, it really, not only in this country, but also across, you know, Western Europe, is what distinguishes, at the end of the day, the United States from the rest of the world. Like, when we think about China now and how China is going to be a great power, but could a story like mine ever be possible in China? And I would tell you right now, that's not actually possible at all. So when the United States, first of all, it was absolutely incredible that the Taliban could take over the country at the pace that they did, which was less than 2 weeks. They took over the entire country. And then for us, for leaders of this country and this administration in particular, to then let them enter Kabul while we were still in Afghanistan, American troops are still in Afghanistan, that was another episode that really, really angered, should anger a lot of us. So my family, just to tell you a little bit about the geography of Afghanistan, this is exactly what the country looks like. This is where Kabul is, the capital, and my family lived in northwestern Afghanistan, a major city called Herat. 2 days before the Taliban took over that city, I flew the family from Herat, Afghanistan to Kabul because I knew that province was going to fail and it was going to fall, and it did fall to the Taliban. 2 days later, my family got on the last plane from Herat city to Kabul, on the last plane. If they didn't get on that plane, they wouldn't have been able to get out. And then once they were in Kabul, the idea for us was to find a place for them in Tajikistan or Turkey just to get out of Kabul, and then eventually sponsor them to come to the United States. But then Kabul fell on August 15, and when Kabul fell, I went into a panic, because I knew that there was no way they were going to leave, the Taliban were going to leave my family untouched. I knew that they were going to go after them, they were going to murder them. I mean, they've done far worse things to people that, were not even involved with the U.S. government, like journalists or civil, rights activists and all of that. And so then I got a hold of our Adjutant General, the Illinois National Guard Adjutant General, Colonel Buckman knows him, Major General Neely, a really, really great guy. And I said, you got to write a letter to the State Department, to the Department of Defense, and say, look, this guy is my service member. I work with him for the last 7 months, and his family needs to be evacuated because they are in danger. And then I reached out. We had met Senator Duckworth on one of the vaccination sites, and I reached out to both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, and trying to plead with them to talk to somebody in the State Department to coordinate my family's evacuation from Kabul. And it didn't work. It didn't work. Nobody could help. Nobody could, every agency, government agency, essentially the US government, when it came to Afghanistan, it shut down. It shut down. The system became overwhelmed because they didn't expect such a result. So, and then what happened was that, I luckily was able to connect with an old CIA contact, and I said, can you do something about this? And I knew they could do something because the CIA, at the time this was classified, it's no longer classified. The CIA operated a special gate within Kabul airport, and only CIA contacts could utilize that gate. And it took us a long time to get the family on a bus, on a CIA designated bus, and get the family inside the airport. They went through hell in order to just be able to get inside the airport. They were not too far from the day that suicide attack happened outside of Kabul airport, killed 13 US service members, 170 Afghans, many of them just people who had worked for us trying to get inside the airport. And once they were inside, the family was inside the airport, thanks to a lot of people, they were able to get inside get into a C-17 and then be flown to Doha, Qatar, and then from there to Germany, and then eventually to the United States. And then once the family, I got my family out, word got out, I was on Fox News, CNN, and then these senators started reaching out to me. They're like, how can we get our constituents out? I mean, just to think about a United States senator feeling helpless, not being able to help. I got a call from a Republican senator. I got a call from Senator Duckworth's office. Is the state of U.S. Senator from Illinois. And it just was amazing to watch that, because how is it possible that, and I asked one night, I in frustration asked a senior officer at the Pentagon late at night, and I said, when you say the U.S. government cannot do anything, how is that possible? How is it possible that they cannot do anything? And she said, it's because the State Department is handling these evacuations from Afghanistan, and they're getting their directives from the White House. And I personally feel, and this is, I'm not trying to obviously get political here, they really didn't know what the heck they were doing. And when they left Afghanistan on August 30th, the mandate the agreement with the Taliban was that the U.S. should get out by August 31st. They got out a day earlier for no reason, and then they left thousands of American citizens and permanent residents behind, and those people are still there. Granted, now there are evacuation flights, but a significant number of Americans are still, at the mercy of the Taliban. Sorry, that was.
No, that's good. And so then, talk a little bit about the next leg. So when your mom and dad and 3 siblings, were all 5 of them on the same flight?
On the same flight.
Exactly. Okay. Did they go from there to walk us through the journey here?
So they went from there, and then so this was another really tricky part of the evacuation process. Once you were inside Kabul airport, you could have been grabbed by anybody because it wasn't really the United States. The United States did like 95% of these evacuation flights, but other governments were involved also, like Germany. There were even flights going to Poland. And then there were flights that were, a couple of flights even, I believe, went to Uganda. So you could go anywhere once you got picked up. But my challenge was to get the family manifested on a flight to the United States, obviously, because I didn't want the family to go to Uganda and then, go through hell for a few years there before they made their way here. So we got the family manifested. When I say we, it was the CIA contact and I. We got them manifested on a flight to the United States. And once they were inside the airport, it took them 15 minutes to get inside that C-17. They went to Qatar. We have a base, our largest Middle East base is in Qatar, called Al Udeid. They went to Al Udeid. They were there for a couple of weeks. No, they weren't there for a couple of weeks. They were there for a couple of days. From there, they went to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. They were there for 2 or 3 weeks. I remember you and I talking about it, and Colonel Buckman was trying to actually find a chaplain to connect with the family there. And then from there, they came to Quantico, Virginia, and they've been there since September 11th, and they're waiting to get released and get processed now.
Have you gotten to see them here?
Yes, I've seen them a couple of times, and they're happy where they are. They're quite relieved, especially in retrospect. They continue to obviously monitor events in Afghanistan, and it's just getting a lot more worse by the day. Quite awful.
And then they will come, and the short-term plan is that they will, maybe medium-term plan, but they will come and stay with you and your wife.
Yes, that's the objective. Get them, just to get them through the trauma of what they've been through, and then eventually, obviously, get the siblings educated, and both of them, the younger siblings, two siblings will stay with me. One of them was married, and she left for New Mexico. She was married to a gentleman from New Mexico. But yeah, the goal is to get them educated, and the younger siblings, they both have shown interest in joining the Army, so we'll see how that works.
So I got this question from a very brilliant man.
All right.
And how would you assess the global war on terror? Was it primarily a success or a failure? What do you think could have been done differently? What do you think should be done in the future?
The global war on terror, I remember it's a term that President George W. Bush came up with right after 9/11. I would say it's going to have to be over, even if in practice it's not over. In theory, we're going to call it over because the bigger threat today is China, and that's part of the reason why the United States wanted to leave Afghanistan to pivot away from the Middle East and focus on China, because obviously China is going to be a much bigger threat than the Middle East is currently to the United States. I would say it was a success because the United States was able to kill Osama bin Laden, who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But one of the things that the United States, failed really badly in Afghanistan at was that it lacked a strategic depth, right? Like going into the country, we didn't know how long we were going to be there for. We didn't know what we were going to do in Afghanistan. And we just stayed and stayed and stayed without really ever realizing what is it that we're trying to accomplish in this country. So for example, if the agenda and the objective eventually was to get the Taliban to the negotiating table and tell them, look, you can't sponsor Al-Qaeda, you cannot become a host nation for militant groups, then we could have done it right after 2001 when the United States first went into Afghanistan, because a couple of months after the United States took over Afghanistan, the Taliban leadership came to the United States and said, we're ready to negotiate. Let's negotiate and we can be part of this new government. And the United States said no. And that was a huge failure on the part of the United States to not essentially think, look, we came, we defeated the Taliban, we are going to remove and root out Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, and just let's bring an inclusive government together where the rights of women and minority groups, especially Christians. Afghanistan has Christians, and over the last 20 years, that community has grown. And unfortunately, and I'll tell you that there are a lot of groups inside the United States right now, and luckily they have a lot of resources, Glenn Beck is one of those people. He has been raising a lot of funds for Afghan Christians and trying to get them out. So, yeah.
So one of the questions that was written kind of ties in with that. The culture of Christians in Afghanistan has historically seemed to be underground. With the Taliban in control, how difficult is it for a Christian to practice in Afghanistan now?
Oh, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. There is no way. Even under the previous government, it was quite difficult, especially if you were outside of major cities. But right now, it's impossible. It just immediately means, it's immediately a death sentence. That's how bad it is.
Okay, all right. We can take questions from the floor too, if anybody would like to ask a question. Okay.
I was born in 1988, like I said, when the Soviets were still there. Part of this mess that we have in Afghanistan actually started in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Prior to that, it was a pretty stable, decent country. H.R. McMaster was a general that served as President Trump's national security advisor when President Trump first said, look, we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. H.R. McMaster showed pictures of Afghan women from the 1960s where they were dressed more liberally than some women in America today. And he said, look, this country, we can turn this country into what it was. And it could have been turned into a country like that had it not been really for the Soviet invasion in 1979. And the United States government had a huge part in arming some of the people that are now fighting against the United States to defeat the Soviet Union. But growing up, my family was in Kabul until 1996. And then what happened in 1996, the Taliban took over. That's the first time. September of 1996 is when they took over the country. And my family had to evacuate to Western Afghanistan. So I grew up under the Taliban regime.
And are the Taliban primarily a particular ethnic group?
Yes. Pashtun ethnic group, Sunni brand of Islam. And one of the things I have to say, and you most likely know this, the United States, part of the reason the United States failed in Afghanistan, not militarily, but politically. So there is a huge distinction there. Because every time, I can tell you that the vast majority of American casualties in Afghanistan didn't come from direct combat, right? It came from IEDs, the improvised explosive devices. The United States failed politically because of Pakistan, one of the major reasons. Remember, for the last 20 years, Pakistan has been receiving billions of dollars in foreign aid from the United States, but it has been arming, training. Just think about where the United States found Osama bin Laden. It wasn't in Afghanistan. And also keep in mind that the Afghans in Afghanistan had nothing to do with 9/11. Absolutely nothing. All 19 were Arabs. They were not Afghan. And so for the last 20 years, the Pakistanis have been saying we're friends of the United States, but they have been arming and training and equipping these vicious animals against the United States government and against the Afghan government. Quite unfortunate, but the reason the United States really hasn't been able to do anything about Pakistan because it has nuclear weapons, and it's quite a dangerous country, really. It's a country that I would argue hates the United States the most, and it's quite unfortunate.
Dick.
So,
secondly, what is the reason the Taliban
was organized? Those are really, really good questions. So the Taliban, as a movement, singular, it's this plural form of Talib. Talib meaning student, just a student. And the reason they call themselves students, Taliban, is because they were trained in madrasas in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So they're calling themselves that because they're saying, look, we're religious scholars. We're students of Islam. That's really what the term means. The reason they were successful in 1996 when they took over the country the first time, and the reason they were successful this time around, was because in 1996, the communist government that was installed by the Soviets had collapsed. The mujahideen that were running the country, they were quite corrupt. Criminal activity was prevalent, corruption, just like this time around, was prevalent, and the people just couldn't take it. And so a bunch of Talibs came together, and they asked Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, and they said, hey, do something about this. So that's how the group was created, and that's how they started then getting funding and training from the Pakistani government to take over the Afghan government in 1996. And the reason this time around they succeeded is because this former Afghan government that just collapsed, led by a man named Ashraf Ghani, that was a US citizen, Afghan American, was because, again, corruption was the biggest problem in Afghanistan. And our government, the United States government, really never did a good job of holding Afghan leadership accountable and saying, look, you need to do better, especially when it comes to corruption. And there were two Afghanistans, just like any country, right? You had the urban elites and you had the rural areas. If you were in any urban area in Afghanistan, you had it pretty good. You had it really good. You worked, chances are where you worked for a foreign government, you got paid with US dollars, you were under the protection of the United States and the Afghan government, where it had a huge security presence. But if you were in rural areas, the government had completely forgotten about you. And the vast majority of Afghans live in non-urban areas. So when the Taliban showed up, they're like, okay, this government cannot give us security nor jobs. The Taliban will not give us jobs, but at least they will give us security. And that's really what happened.
Mm.
No, they're good on that front. Thank you. No, they're good. Thank you. Thank you. Plus, I'm in Northern Virginia, so we talked about it early on, and it's going to be quite difficult logistically. Thank you, though.
Anybody else?
That's a really good question. They're very involved. And in the last several years, 4 countries have been really critical in getting the Taliban where they are. Primarily, it's Pakistan. Second, it's China. Then it's Iran. Then Russia. And all those four governments right now are trying to get the rest of the international community to recognize the Taliban. China is heavily involved. Afghanistan is, speaking minerally, in terms of its natural resources, is very rich. They're saying it's got over $1 trillion in terms of natural mineral resources. And of course, the Chinese, they don't care who you are. They don't care what kind of politics you have. They're interested in the natural resources, and that's why they have had several delegations sent to Afghanistan. The Taliban have gone to China. That's the tragedy of the United States involvement, that it went there for 20 years. The American soldiers bleeded there. We spent close to $1 trillion, and now it's the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis that are the major beneficiaries of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
In your opinion, because the media is very divided, but how many actual families or people have been left behind up to today?
Initially, the number was 14,000 people. Now, I would say it's still in the thousands. There are a lot of, the government, really, the US government hasn't had any success in evacuating people. This is why, even if today you call any senator or your congressman or congresswoman, they're not going to be able to do anything for you, which is quite a remarkable thing, because on any other front, if they really want to do something, they can do it. And the reason Americans are getting out right now, or people, Afghans at risk who work for the US government, is because of the veterans community. It has been really, really helpful, and the intelligence community, and just, the private sector industry just pulling resources together and saying, look, we will fund this flight. And these flights cost a lot of money. I mean, we're talking about $1 million to $2 million just to get a plane sent to Afghanistan and then flying it to Qatar.
Here's another question. What would be a preferred relationship between the United States and the Taliban leadership from now on concerning the human rights crisis in Afghanistan if the U.S. no longer wishes to continue its military intervention on the ground?
Yeah, so the U.S. government is saying, look, we're going to continue with the over-the-horizon capabilities, which is drone attacks, and mainly, but it's not going to be able to do it because the United States does not have a base, in countries that surround Afghanistan, like Pakistan, Tajikistan, or Uzbekistan. Obviously, Iran is not an option. So that option is really off the table. So when it comes to really verifying whether the Taliban are working with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups or not, the United States will not have really good intelligence nor capabilities of verifying something like that. The relationship right now, the United States government just signed an agreement with the Qatari government to represent the United States interests in Afghanistan. And that's, again, it's quite shameful because you're talking about the most powerful country, go to a small Middle Eastern country and say, look, you deal with the Taliban on behalf of the US government. Going forward, unless the Taliban really change, which I don't think it's possible for them to change, and create an inclusive government where women are represented, minority groups are represented, and they really, really say, look, we're going to abandon violence against a lot of people, the U.S. government, there's not going to, politically it will be impossible for any administration, Republican or Democrat, to sign any kind of agreement with the Taliban.
The United States still have military and intelligence resources in Afghanistan?
We can't talk about that, unfortunately.
Do you believe that the Taliban will still be in power within the next few years?
That remains to be seen. I think they will be in power if countries like China see their interest in seeing them in power, Pakistan. If they have the support of those countries, absolutely. But I can tell you that Afghanistan has changed. It's not the Afghanistan of 20 years. The population, has grown significantly. It's now a country of 38 million people. A lot of people, got educated over the last 20 years. So it's going to be, at the end of the day, if they cannot put food on the table for people, their chances of survival in the long term is going to be quite limited. But again, if they have the support of countries like China, I think they're going to keep going, unfortunately.
Well, it's closing up on 8 o'clock here. I want to encourage everybody to consider making a donation. We're going to take a love offering. There's a basket in the back. And if you haven't had a chance to do so already, we'd encourage you to do that. Fahim, we have been so blessed to have you here.
Thank you.
And,
an honor to be here. Thank you.
And I'm so glad I got to meet you. And we have had a lot of good discussions, and I think this might be the LCC mic. This is the first time in a while I've worn 2 mics. Can I just hold it like this? Yep. So I just want to say thank you for coming out here and sharing. I know this is not an easy conversation to have. It's not easy to talk about, and it's very emotional.
Absolutely.
This is your family, and you have a wonderful wife, and she's a great support, and she keeps you humble too.
Yeah.
And as a good wife does, and it just was a real joy to get to meet her also.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And so we wish safe travels for you.
Absolutely.
And you and I will be traveling tonight.
Yeah. Safe travels for both of us.
Yes. Yeah. Any last questions from anybody? Okay.
Thank you again. Appreciate you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right, so